it's very easy for us to take those sorts of things for granted, both the freedom, the economic opportunity, and in a very real sense, the economic wealth that comes from those sorts of things. And one of the problems of the income inequality data, focusing on it too much, makes us focus on, well, how are the other people doing?
Welcome to Acton Line, a podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. P.J. Hill, professor of economics emeritus at Wheaton College and a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, delves into the topic of economic inequality and envy based on a lecture he gave at Acton University in 2022. Sarah Negri, research project coordinator at Acton, sits down with Hill to talk about the different kinds of economic inequality, the difference between inequality and poverty, and the economic and moral problems with envy being the modern standard mindset towards those who create mass wealth. They discuss the relationship between inequality and injustice with regard to human dignity, including what moral obligations might go hand in hand with being wealthy, as well as whether economic measures which have the goal of lessening inequality, such as resource transfers, are effective. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome to Acton Line. I'm Sarah Negri, research project coordinator at the Acton Institute, and I'm here with Dr. P.J. Hill, professor of economics emeritus at Wheaton College, Illinois, and senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, where he currently resides. Dr. Hill is the co-author with Terry L. Anderson and Douglas North of Growth and Welfare in the American Past, with Terry Anderson of The Birth of a Transfer Society, and also with Terry Anderson of The Not-So-Wild Wild West, Property Rights on the Frontier. He has also written numerous articles on the theory of property rights and institutional change, and has edited 6 books on environmental economics. His undergraduate degree is from Montana State and his PhD from the University of Chicago. Dr. Hill grew up on a cattle ranch in eastern Montana, which he operated with his family until 1992, when he sold the ranch and bought a smaller ranch in western Montana, which he operated until 2012. Dr. Hill, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's good to be here.
So today we'd like to focus on the lecture that you recently gave for Acton University, which was titled Envy and Economic Inequality. And it's a fascinating topic. I think it's something a lot of people will be interested in. To start out, can you define for us the different kinds of inequality we're talking about when we use the term economic inequality?
Certainly. The reason that I actually thought about lecturing on it is there's been a lot more concern in the last 15 or 20 years with measuring the level of economic inequality in a society. And what we usually mean by that is income inequality. So we look at the differences in income of different people, different families, different groups, and then we try to track them over time. Now, there's all sorts of other inequalities. We are concerned, appropriately so, with inequality of opportunity. There are lots of different inequalities that come from some of the circumstances that we're in, some of them from because of our natural abilities, because of the families that we grew up in. The economic inequality is just a straightforward measure of what was your income, say, in a particular year, and then comparing that to the income of other people. And they usually put it into groups, like, say, the bottom 10%, say, the middle 50%, or the middle 30%. And then there's a lot of concern for what we would call the very wealthy, which is the income of the top 1%. And that's the measure that I'm looking at, and actually the measure that I'm reacting to.
And what would you say wealth inequality refers to?
Well, wealth inequality, there's a difference between income and wealth and inequality, and they are related, not as closely as sometimes as people think. Wealth inequality is actually your stock of capital or your stock of wealth. So it might include your home, it may include the clothes in your closet, it might include your stock holdings, all of those sorts of things. Income inequality is actually the flow of money that you're getting in a particular year. So one of them is what we'd call a stock concept, and the other is a flow concept. I actually like the income inequality data better. There's all sorts of issues when you do wealth inequality. Do you include a person's retirement account? For instance, many measures don't include your retirement account. Others don't include your home. For many middle-class people, those are some of the things that really add to their wealth. And if you leave those out, then you get very biased sorts of numbers. And so the income inequality is actually a better picture of actually what's going on in people's lives than the wealth inequality is.
Thanks for making that clarification. Inequality is a loaded moral term.
You're correct.
You mentioned in your talk there's a lot of political and economic commentators who say it's the fundamental defining issue of our time.
Right. It's become a big political issue. Part of that is just because we're able to do a better job of actually measuring income inequality. Economists have been able to get access to tax data, usually without names on it, so it's not as if they're trying to follow up on particular people. But they can look at tax data, income for particular people. We didn't used to have as much information there, but now there's these actual measures of what the level of income is for a particular person, or sometimes it's by household unit, and then after doing that, and that's become a very big kind of political issue. People make a big deal out of the fact that there is income inequality, and one of the issues now is what about changes in inequality? For instance, a famous economist, Thomas Piketty, actually he's a French economist, but has written widely on it. He does measures of income inequality in the U.S., and his claim is that there's been rising inequality in the U.S., namely that a larger share of our income is actually going, say, to the top 5% or top 1%. Those numbers have been contested. There's a lot of economists that work on actually what's going on. My lecture was on a bigger sort of an issue in the sense of how much should we be concerned about income inequality? And sometimes people are using the term inequality really as kind of a shorthand for poverty. We think about, oh my goodness, there's an increase in inequality. That could well mean that there's more poverty in society. That's not necessarily the case, and I would argue that if we're concerned about poverty, we should go directly to measures of poverty. There's some issues, some problems there, but it's much more straightforward to look at measures of poverty for measures of hardship or marginalized people, whereas if we look at just income inequality, that doesn't really tell us what's going on.
Exactly. I think that's a very helpful distinction. It seems like one of the fundamental differences there is poverty describes a state or a condition that somebody's in without a necessary reference to somebody else, whereas inequality, you have this comparison to somebody else that's part of the essence of the definition, and so there's comparison going on there. And these metrics can be very helpful to have comparative metrics, but what would you say is the problem with maybe that comparative mindset, or where does envy come in when we're constantly comparing this to somebody else?
The problem that I see is that if you just look at the income inequality data, and particularly the way that it's presented, whenever the wealthy get perhaps a larger share, and again, there's the measurement issue, but when the wealthy get a larger share of the income, or their income goes up by 10%, and the income of other people maybe only goes up by 3%, then that can be regarded as kind of a moral wrong, as a very real sort of an issue. And my argument is that the way the data is looked at and the way that many public spokespeople present it is that you should be, if you will, that they're almost making a case for envy, that when somebody else does well, that you should be concerned. Now, the thing about that I find to be interesting is that the income of almost all groups have gone up over the last 20 years. As we go back historically, sometimes it goes up more rapidly for the people, say, in the bottom 20%. Sometimes it doesn't go up as rapidly. The long-term historical evidence is that the income of the people in the bottom 10% goes up at about the same rate as the income of the rest of the people in society. Now, that's a long-term sort of a conclusion, and there certainly in some periods of time it goes up more rapidly for people in a particular group. Other times it goes up less rapidly. But the envy comes from the fact that income inequality data causes you to look at other people's doing well and feeling offended by it. Not so much that you didn't do well, but that you're offended by the fact that some other people did well. And in a modern economy, what I would call an economy based on positive sum interactions, when somebody does well and it doesn't harm us, and it's the result of a whole group of morally appropriate interactions, then the question is, why should I be offended when somebody down the street does better or does well? Now, again, there's the question of injustice, and we can come back to that issue. There are injustices in the society, and we need to be very thoughtful, very careful about dealing with those. But differences in income do not necessarily represent increases in injustice, and therefore that's where envy comes in. It becomes kind of, being sad over the well-being or the increase in well-being of another person. And there's some question about the real moral question is, why should we be offended when somebody else does well?
Sure. I would like to come back to the idea of injustice. I think many people tend to equate even the term inequality with injustice, that somehow we're all the same or we all deserve the same. And there's some truth to that in the sense that we all have equal dignity as humans. And so I think the difficult part of that is you latch onto the half-truth that everybody has the same dignity, and you tend to equate that with the same economic status, or everybody should have the same amount of things. Where's the danger in sort of extrapolating between the true equal dignity that we have as humans with the economic status that maybe we all should have the same thing?
Certainly. Part of it is that God has gifted us with different sorts of abilities, different interests. For instance, some people decide to are fitted for and decide to go on for higher education. Usually that means a period of time of lower income, unless you happen to be fortunate enough to get maybe a rich scholarship student. But for many people, they will go through 4, 5, 6 years of relative economic deprivation while they're going on to school. Their friends may have at that point gone into the workforce and have earned more during that period of time. So if you want to measure the inequality, well, there's an increase in inequality because the people that immediately entered the workforce may be doing quite well. Then when the person finishes their training, and again, we know that not all higher education training produces higher income, but some people have chosen a path that allows them then to earn higher incomes. And so as a result of human choices, foundational sorts of differences in income, we get different sorts of results. Now, again, I would argue we can and we should do something about to make sure that public policy recognizes equal human dignity. We can do that in a much more straightforward measure. Now, historically, we have not done that. I mean, there have been all sorts of cases of injustice as we look at a country like the United States. But we can rectify those, and we don't. And if we do a good job of that, then that just allows the person the freedom then to go ahead and organize their life. Some people are very willing to trade off more leisure time and have less income. Other people are willing to make sacrifices to have higher income. Once we start trying to intervene in terms of measured outcomes, then we're really looking for a continuous, ongoing program trying to change the result of human choices. That's different than poverty, and that's different than injustices. So if we make that commitment that we're just going to be measured the justice of a society by equality of outcomes, we're committing to a very, very large and a very intrusive amount of government in our lives.
That seems fundamental to me, that you emphasize the freedom to choose your path to prosperity, and people choose different things based on their gifts, based on the different inherent natural inequalities that are immeasurable. Mm-hmm. Where do you think we can make changes to allow for more of that freedom, where we remove some of these obstacles, where people who maybe have the gifts or the potential to choose something that would lead to higher prosperity actually have the ability to do so?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to see much greater equality of opportunity in terms of education. And I would say that public provision of education is something that we have committed to as a society. I consider that to be a moral good. What we call human capital, or investment in people, has become more and more important over time. Historically, it was physical capital and manual labor. Today, most of our income is produced by what we call human capital, which is really a set of skills, a set of knowledge, the ability to solve problems. In fact, one of the important sorts of things is the ability just to work with other people. So we have a system that's designed to try to help people, maybe people that come from a disadvantaged background, to make sure that they get an increase in opportunity through the opportunity to, or through the whole mechanism of investment in human capital. And I do regard what has happened to education in the United States as very, very unfortunate. There's great differences in the ability of our school system to give opportunities to all people, and particularly for those people that might be starting from a lower economic level. And so you look at some, say, inner city schools, and you'll find that the differences between what's available for students there is just very substantial when we compare that to, say, schools in other parts of the United States. So that would certainly be one of the places that I would work to think about trying to make sure that there are greater opportunities. Now, again, these take some sort of action on the part of the individual. So then there's a whole host of other social and moral characteristics. Are people willing to invest in that? So there's sometimes cultural constraints. Those are unfortunate. Some people actually, their peers will discourage them from going on for more education. That's unfortunate. We can try to deal with some of those. I think the examples of people who have been in the past marginalized or not have had greater opportunity, and then when some of them have gone on to do well, need to be held up as exemplars in a community as, if this is what you want, if you really want economic opportunity, here's some of the steps that you need to take.
It's good to have examples to look to. Can you comment a little bit about the opposite of envy? What is the role, what would you say the opposite of envy is?
Well, certainly for us as Christians, the major sort of a thing is just simply gratitude. And of course, God calls us to be grateful even in situations that we find to be very uncomfortable. So there's a whole set of theological doctrines about accepting and living with suffering, and suffering can actually be good for the soul. I'm not sure that God wants us to ask for suffering, but in the middle of suffering, we can trust God in terms of his providence. As we look economically, though, I just think for most people in the United States, simply an attitude of gratitude for the fact that we have access to goods and services that were just unthinkable 100 years ago, 200 years ago, even as recently. For instance, I'll give a personal example here. My mother was born in 1909. She grew up on a cattle ranch in eastern Montana. Every year at Christmas time, she would get an orange. That was the only piece of fresh fruit that she would see for 4 months. And she would hold that orange. She'd actually peel it back a little, run her fingernail through the skin and smell of the orange. And then finally she would peel it and she would just savor it piece by piece. Now, they were not a family that was in economic hardship, but for many people, particularly living in northern climes, fresh fruit was something that you enjoyed during season. You know, you could eat strawberries during strawberry season. You could eat blueberries during the season that blueberries came on. Now, it's interesting, in the middle of the winter, all over the northern United States, you can walk into a grocery store and you can have a panoply of fresh fruit. We in Montana eat grapes in January. That is an absolutely unusual sort of a circumstance. In the middle of that, it's very easy for us to take those sorts of things for granted, both the freedom, the economic opportunity, and in a very real sense, the economic wealth that comes from those sorts of things. And one of the problems of the income inequality data, focusing on it too much, makes us focus on, well, how are the other people doing? And I would say instead we should focus on how are we doing? And again, sometimes there is hardship. Families go through poverty, but particularly during those times when we do have enough food on the table, when we have a warm home. Remember again that for most of history, only the rich people could keep their dwelling place at a comfortable temperature 24 hours a day. For most people, they lived with a fireplace or a stove, and so they would have a source of fuel, and during the daytime, they would put enough fuel in it. They might have been short on fuel, and they might not have been able to keep their house comfortable. But in almost all homes until the 1860s or 1870s, and even later for many homes, comfort, a comfortable temperature during the daytime was something that was only available for wealthy people that had hired somebody to stoke the fireplace or to stoke the furnace. Most people got up to a house in which the temperature might be freezing. It was not unusual for people to get up and find ice on the water bucket. Almost none of us experience that now. If we go on a camping trip and that happens, then we come back and we tell it as a tale of how the great hardship that we were in. And when I got up in the morning, there was ice crystals on my sleeping bag. Well, that was the situation that almost everybody lived in. So I just think some gratitude. I try to make a point in my life of thinking when I take a hot shower in the morning, what an unusual circumstance this is. I get hot water every morning. People throughout history, the idea of hot water by the turning of a faucet would have been absolutely incredible. Now, again, there were the Roman baths. There were rich people could have heated water. For almost all of the population, you wanted hot water. You got it from a well. You put a container on some sort of a heating device, either a stove or a fireplace, and then you ended up with 3 quarts of hot water, and that was your hot water for several hours. And so the idea that we could have all of these sorts of things, and we become, if you will, just almost inured to them. We don't think about the actual benefits from them. So I would say one of the things that we should think about is just gratitude that we happen to live in a society where there's 2 very important components. One is, and that's probably the most important one, is freedom. Large degrees of freedom. And there's a lot of margins on which we can, think about, is it as much as we want? Are there different areas? I would argue there has been a decrease in freedom in certain aspects in the U.S., but still overall, we are a relatively free country. That is something to be very grateful for. The Acton Institute has been a very thoughtful player in the argument for freedom. And then, of course, for most of us, we enjoy material prosperity. Again, I'm not arguing that everybody in the United States is there, and certainly for much of the world, they're not there. So my arguments about income not being too concerned about income inequality does not mean that we should ignore poverty issues in the U.S. or poverty issues worldwide.
Certainly. I think that attitude of gratitude you talk about is very important too. And would you say that it actually can help when you are looking at other people, especially
Yes.
the very wealthy?
Yes.
You can almost be grateful for their prosperity and their contributions to the general
Right.
standard of living for the society.
Right. And that's an important point. Throughout history, there have been, the kind of, if you will, condemnations of excessive wealth. And the biblical account, the biblical narrative actually has that. You can look at the book of Amos. You can look at some of Christ's teachings about wealth. And there's great concern, first of all, that wealth can be corrupting. And that is a very real sort of a concern. Too much wealth can take our eyes off of what is true, what is valuable, the sorts of things that we should be devoting our lives to. The other thing, though, is historically, in societies that had not put together what we call the mechanisms for a free and virtuous society, then it could well be that when you looked at wealth, it was an issue of either they were taking advantage of corruption, they were getting special favors, they were able to hold some people in subjugation or in exploitation. And so it is in a growing society or a society that is free and prosperous that I would argue that economic inequality is not a particularly good measure that we should be envious of. Now, I'm not sure that envy is the appropriate human attitude, even in societies where there's massive exploitation. But there still should be a great concern for injustice in those societies. So my arguments that economic inequality are not a particularly good measure really focuses on societies where basically most people are encouraged to play positive-sum games. So as we look at wealthy people in our society, most of them have gotten wealth by actually producing wealth for other people. And that is actually a good sort of a thing. So they get wealthy, but the way that you get wealthy in a society of exchange and well-defined and enforced property rights is by finding ways to satisfy the wishes of other people. And so then when we look at their wealth, we say, aha, that must mean that they've done a lot of things to make other people better off.
I think that distinction is very important. Can you comment on the moral obligations of those who are very materially well off to those who are less so, if you think there are any?
Sure. There certainly are. But two things, both making sure that they recognize the human dignity, if they are employers, the dignity of their employees, treating them as fully human, being concerned about their welfare, all of those sorts of things. And so just the activities that they're undergoing, making sure that they represent their products honestly, not engaging in fraud or deceit. But then there's the other sort of a question of if you become wealthy, what do you do with it? And I would regard the whole movement by several wealthy people to actually say that they need to be philanthropic and give away a major portion of their wealth. That's a good sort of a thing. I would say that it is complicated to give away your wealth well. I mean, that's not an easy sort of a thing. And for my listeners that are in families, think about that with your children. As your children become older, how much How much do you give them? How much wealth do you transfer to them? When they're teenagers, do you give them an allowance? If so, how much? Do you make them work for it? If they, in periods of distress, how much do you come to their aid? So even in these situations when we have really good knowledge about people that we love and we care about, I would argue that most families go through just a lot of, if you will, periods of consideration, thinking about, well, what is the right sort of a thing to do? So philanthropy is a very appropriate moral response to the people who've done very well in our economic world. And so then the question is, what do you do about it? And I do think transferring money, and some of the philanthropists have done, great, they've taken lots of sorts of actions that have been appropriate. After the Civil War, after the freeing of the slaves, there were still some huge moral problems. A few years later, we got the Jim Crow laws, which were terribly discriminatory. So there's all sorts of things that happened that were very inappropriate and very morally unjustifiable. However, there was a whole group of philanthropists who went about setting up more educational opportunities for people that had come out of slavery, and we get what we call the historically black colleges, and there's a whole group of them. Now, probably would have been a more appropriate morally if the other colleges would have been more open to allowing all people to come to them. But those colleges were set up usually with philanthropic money to make sure that people coming out of slavery had opportunities for education. They were just an important sort of an effort. So now we look at all sorts of efforts. Of course, as you probably know, the Gates Foundation puts a very large amount of money into philanthropic exercises, and they actually hire several thousand people to try to make sure that it's going to the right place. Now, that raises all sorts of interesting issues. Warren Buffett, a very wealthy person, has actually been on the board of the Gates Foundation, and a Wall Street Journal article yesterday, I think it was saying that he thought that the Gates Foundation was putting too much money into overhead and not enough into direct giving. That's just an interesting issue. It just says, we don't know exactly how to go about giving money well. But just in terms of the moral obligation, yes, I would say that people who earn wealth have clear obligations to try to share their wealth. Now, it's easy for us who I would call myself kind of a middle-class American, it's easy for us in our position to think that, well, it's those people at the top that should be sharing.
We're all called to generosity on some level, for sure.
Right, we are. And I have an incident that really kind of brought me up short. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I was teaching at Wheaton College, and there was all sorts of exchange programs. People were coming to the U.S. from some of the countries, Russia, some of the other countries to the east of there, and a group of Russian school teachers came to the U.S. They were kind of middle-class Russian people, and Wheaton hosted them, and my responsibility was to give them some economic lectures. And I think there was probably a half a dozen of them in the group. And so at the end of our time, we asked if there were things that they would like to know more about. And the lady that was in charge of the group kind of shyly said, we've been in the U.S. for 2 weeks now, and we've never been in an American home. Well, that's interesting. Here we're taking them to all of these educational institutions and doing those sorts of things. We lived about 10 minutes from campus. I called my wife. I said, are the beds made? The beds were made. And I said, great, I'm going to show up with a half a dozen Russians in 15 minutes. So I gave them a tour of our house. And we had, I was teaching, Wheaton is a kind of a middle-class suburb. There's actually some wealth there that does not belong to the Wheaton professors as much as it does to some other sorts of people. But we lived in a typical kind of a middle-class Wheaton home. We actually had 4 bedrooms in the house. One of the bedrooms isn't much bigger than the bathrooms in some of the houses that you see now. We had an unfinished basement. So we went through the whole house and talking about it and looking at the fact, that we looked at our kitchen and we looked at our dining room and our living room and all those sorts of things. And as we finished, the lady that was in charge of the tour said, well, this is really interesting. How many families live here?
Wow.
Talk about feeling, like, my goodness, here she was, a middle-class person from another country, finding it hard to believe that I, as a middle-class American, could live in this 2-story house with a family of 5. And it just struck me again of how wealthy I was and how easy it was for me to simply say, oh, we're just kind of regular people and we don't need to think about sharing. And so it was just, again, the evidence that for those of us in the United States, we all live at not all, but most of us live at very comfortable levels. And so we have lots of opportunities and opportunities that we should act upon to be generous with our resources. Interestingly enough, we also need to be generous with our time. And for some of us, that's harder than being generous with our physical resources.
Sure. That involves more of a personal investment with the people in our circles.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about the actions we need to take with generosity, there's conversation about the term the preferential option for the poor, where we're turning with greater priority to those in greater need. And that seems to me sort of a shift in direction from this income inequality where you're looking at the richest people and saying, well, why do they have so much? And you distinguish that from the issue of poverty, which is very real. Right. And you kind of shift from that position of envy where you're looking at what you don't have to a position of generosity where you're trying to look at what you can give to those in need. And this discussion of inequality has made me think about the thought experiment of John Rawls with the veil of ignorance, how he is thinking about it in terms of justice, where the person who has the least should have the most possible, even if the person at the top has far less, or even if the sum total of wealth is far less. So, for example, and if I understand this right, the example is along the lines of if the poorest person has 1 coin and the richest person has 5, that's better than if the poorest person has nothing and the richest person has 1,000, even though the sum total of the wealth for the society is much greater. Would you say those concepts are connected, that concern for the lowest common denominator, for the person on the lowest rung of the ladder being an issue of justice rather than inequality?
I would. I would say that there are certain parts of John Rawls' philosophy that I do not find to be particularly convincing to me. For instance, he has what he calls the minimax principle, that any policy that we institute should advantage the poor as much or more than we do with other people in society. That's a policy that you try to institute that I don't find to be particularly meaningful. There are certain parts of the backgrounds of Rawls' philosophy that I don't find compatible with my understanding of natural law and natural rights. So there's those sorts of issues. But the whole idea, the idea of the veil of ignorance, that is we choose policies and we don't know where we're going to end up in the society, that we want a set of policies that does actually pay some attention to the people that are marginalized, thinking about that we may be one of those sorts of people. I think we should be willing to institute those policies without necessarily going behind the veil of ignorance. But if that's a helpful mechanism to take us there, then that's an appropriate way to think about those sorts of things. The difficult thing in a wealthy economy like the United States is giving away resources in a way that still respects the dignity and the well-being of the people that we're trying to help. Brian Fickert, an economist at Covenant College, has a very interesting book called When Helping Hurts. And there are times that when we're involved in helping, that we may actually harm the person by taking away their moral agency, by trying to do things for them that we think is the right sort of a thing to do. And some of the problems in the U.S. are very complex and difficult to deal with. For instance, the rise in homelessness. Much of the problem of homelessness is not remediable by simply just transferring more resources to those people. Many of them are having all sorts of issues in their lives, and so just simply trying to say, if we just gave them a place to live, that would solve the problem. There's other dysfunctional aspects that may be behind that. There may be an addiction to alcohol. There may be mental issues. There may be just lots of different sorts of things going on. And sometimes we actually try to buy our way out of those things by simply transferring resources. And in some situations, that's very appropriate. But it's not clear that the poverty in the U.S. is solvable by simply using government to transfer more resources from, say, the better off to the less well off. We do have a very active sort of a transfer program. I think there's ways it could be improved. I think it's appropriate for society to try to take measures to try to care for those who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who've had bad life situations. Not all of what we do today and not all of the supposed answers to those sorts of issues, which oftentimes involve just the transfer of physical resources, is going to be all that successful.
Well, we're getting close to the end here. I'd like to ask you one more question.
Okay.
Can you share with us a couple of just succinct economics lessons that you've learned from your life on the cattle ranch?
Okay, I split my time between an academic career and running a cattle ranch. One of the things that did was make our lives a bit more complicated. One thing I would say from my cattle ranch time was just the value of getting up every day and going to work, and a matter of respect for people in society who are doing that, not drawing kind of these artificial lines between, say, groups of people, classes of people. I found it very healthy when I was at Wheaton College. There'd be people eating lunch. And there was the maintenance crew, the people that collected, that swept the floors, that vacuumed, that picked up the waste baskets. I thought it was healthy for me, and it was actually quite interesting to go and have lunch with them rather than have lunch with professors. And actually, because of my background, where quite a bit of my world was spent with physical work, I came away with respect for that. So that would be one of the lessons that I would say that I took from the cattle ranch. The other thing I would say was I came away with more respect for entrepreneurs and the risk that's involved. And when we look at the wealthy, sometimes they have taken great risks. Sometimes they've gone through periods of great economic hardship in order to get where they are. So that would be the second lesson that I would draw there, is that wealth doesn't automatically happen. And when we look at the wealthy, oftentimes that's a result of risk-taking, it's a result of vision, and it's a result of hard work.
Dr. Hill, it's been a pleasure to have you on Act in Line today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the time.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Act in Line, I'm Eric Cohn.